There are really three elements of scientific naturalism when construed as a worldview. And the first would be the naturalist epistemology, or the naturalist theory of how we know things. There are two major components here, and the first would be what is called weak or strong scientism. Strong scientism is the claim that the only propositions that can be true and known to be true are those in the hard sciences: physics, chemistry, neuroscience. If a claim is not testable in one of the hard sciences, it is neither a true claim nor is it rationally justifiable. Weak scientism allows for there to be a minimal level of justification for beliefs outside the hard sciences, but nevertheless, if there's ever a conflict between an assertion in some field outside the hard sciences and the hard sciences, the scientific claim will win every time, because the epistemic authority of science vastly outweighs the authority of any other field. So that's weak and strong scientism. The second important aspect of the naturalist epistemology is that it embodies a third-person approach to its objects of study. It treats the world as a collection of objects that are located at places in space-time and that have certain physical properties. And so the third person is the way to gain knowledge of reality. Information that comes from a first-person perspective, such as what you're aware of when you introspect, is not considered to be significant. Thus, if we're trying to understand the nature of the mind and consciousness, neuroscience will provide better information than will first-person awareness. The second component of scientific naturalism is what I call the naturalist grand story. Now, this is a broad creation account of how everything that has come into being has come into being. Now, obviously, there's a lot of work to be done on it, but there are certain contours that must be set within which you have to operate in providing a creation account for your view to be considered a naturalistic view. And I will provide three of the key components of the naturalist story of how everything has come to be. The first aspect of that story is it is what is called combinatorial. What I mean by combinatorial is that it will tell a story about how you begin with tiny particles, waves, strings, I don't care what's down, turtles, whatever it is that's down there. And let's just call them particles. And the history of the world is the history of these particles coming together to form larger and more complex arrangements of particles over time. And so the history of the world is a history of aggregation and combination from bottom up, or parts to wholes. The second aspect of this creation story is that it is what we call in philosophy law-governed event causation. Law-governed event causation. Let me explain. The only causes in the world are events, and the only effects in the world are events. So it is the forming of a certain cloud that produces the flashing of lightning. It is the flashing of lightning that produces the splitting of the tree, which produces the falling of the rock, which produces the squashing of the squirrel. Now, what you have is a chain of events. So events cause subsequent events according to laws. And those laws may be probabilistic or deterministic, but in either case, the history of the universe will be the unfolding history of a chain of chains of events where subsequent prior events cause the next events according to some law of nature. The third feature of the naturalist creation account is that there is no teleology. Nothing happens for the sake of a purpose or for the sake of an end. Teleological explanations are given reductive paraphrases, and they are turned into efficient causal stories. And so there just is no teleology. Newton got teleology out of motion. Darwin got teleology out of living organisms. And the behaviorists, Watson and Skinner, got teleology out of human action, where humans don't act for purposes or goals. Rather, their drives, subconscious or conscious, efficiently cause their bodies to move in various ways. So what is the naturalist account of everything? Broadly, it is told in terms of combinatorial processes. It is governed by a strictly event causation according to natural laws, and it eschews teleology. Now, what is the naturalist ontology? The naturalist ontology is either what we might call strict physicalism or a strong physicalism or weak physicalism. According to strong physicalism, the only thing that exists is the space-time universe, and everything within the universe are aggregates of physical particles standing in fields of forces relative to other aggregates of physical particles. So, on this view, everything is completely describable by an ideal physics or chemistry, and everything is completely physical. Now, this is proven to be a failure, and although some won't admit it, but more and more naturalists have weakened their ontology to what's called weak physicalism, and that's the view that number one, everything is either physical or depends on the physical for its emergence. And if something is non-physical, like consciousness or secondary qualities like color, sounds, tastes, and smells, and if things are non-physical, then they're allowed to exist only if they are brought about by and dependent upon the subvenient underlying combination of matter, which reach the right complexity and gives rise to the emergent property. So the ontology is either a complete thoroughgoing physicalism, or it is a weak physicalism according to which there may be mental properties or some kind of properties that aren't physical, but everything that is non-physical depends or is grounded upon the physical. Now, letter D, I want to make careful note of this. The naturalist ontology didn't come from the stork. It wasn't a stork that flew over one day and dropped little bundles of the naturalist ontology in departments in the university. No, the ordering of these three ingredients of a naturalist worldview is very important. The primary commitment of the naturalist is to the epistemology. And so the epistemology in letter A is what justifies the creation story in letter B. And the naturalist ontology must comport with letters A and B. The only thing allowed to exist must be knowable by third-person scientific means. You must be able to locate it or show how it came to be in terms of the creation story. And so that is basically naturalism as a worldview. Now, I want to give a critique of this briefly. There is a more thoroughgoing critique in Scientism and Secularism, a book I wrote a couple of years ago. But this first area of critique will do double duty. It will provide a critique of naturalism, and it will also provide a case for theism, because the facts that I'm going to refer to here are best explained if there's a theistic God and cannot be explained by a naturalist worldview. And the first I want to focus on very quickly is what I call two initial considerations. And the first one is the origin of the universe. I won't go into a great argument for this. I think that argument can be found elsewhere, and I won't elaborate on it here. You can see Bill Craig's works, Reasonable Faith, for that. But the Big Bang, the second law of thermodynamics, the impossibility of crossing an actual infinite number of items, all imply that the past is finite in order for the present to arrive. So that there was a beginning to the universe, where the universe is an aggregate that is composed of space-time and mass energy, physical energy. Now, the difficulty is that it is widely acknowledged that things don't come into existence out of nothing. When Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, says, well, the universe did come into existence out of nothing, he's not talking about nothing. He's talking about a quantum vacuum, which is not nothing. Quantum vacuums are real, allegedly, and if they are real, they have attributes and properties that characterize them. He's not talking about coming to be out of nothing. What the philosopher means by nothing is the absence of any being whatsoever. It is the absence of any attributes, any relations, any events, any particular entities. It is the pure privation of any existent thing. And so, obviously, if I say I got a cake from eggs and flour, the cake was something that was modified from the flour and eggs, but you can't get something from nothing because there's nothing to modify. Nothing is absolutely nothing. And so there had to be a beginning to the universe, but whatever that was is in principle inexplicable scientifically. Science will never be able to explain the origin of the universe, and here's why. In order for science to explain something, you already have to have a universe in present before science can begin explaining. What science does is it explains one aspect of the universe by appealing to another aspect of the universe connected by laws and perhaps an underlying theory, like the ideal gas theory with an explanation of the ideal gas equation. So scientific explanation presupposes that there are existent physical entities before it can even begin doing its explaining. Therefore, it will not be able to explain the very thing it must presuppose before it can begin doing any explaining at all. It follows that science is in principle not the sort of thing that could explain the origin of the universe. And for various reasons, an agent with the power of free choice provides the most rational explanation for the origin of the universe. You're going to have to excuse me. I'm so sorry. I've got something going on in my chest here. Hopefully it's my heart beating, but think besides that. The second thing here is the fine-tuning of the universe and biological information. Now, you've probably heard of the fine-tuning of the universe. It was what caused the late Anthony Flew to give up a half a century of atheism and become a theist. The fine-tuning of the universe just says that there are at least 100 constants of nature, the rest mass of a proton, the charge on an electron, the universal gravitational constant G, the rate of expansion of the Big Bang. There are 100 of these, such that if any single one of them were greater or smaller on the order of sometimes 10 to the minus 6th or 10 to the minus 7th power, then there could be no life whatsoever of any kind in the universe, any biological life. Now, it therefore follows that life-permitting universes are unbelievably rare. And the fact that our universe, that there is such a thing as a life-permitting universe, is best explained by the dice being rigged ahead of time so that life would be able to live in that world. That is a theological explanation. The multiple worlds explanation doesn't work. There are a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is that there's no evidence that there are parallel universes, except that they allow one to avoid a theistic explanation. Information. I would say that the vast majority of people who've thought about information have agreed that it's not physical. And now we can come up with mathematical descriptions of information, like Shannon information and so on. But information, the question of what is the ontological status of information is something that is very seldom thought about. And when it is, it becomes obvious it's not physical. It is an immaterial entity of some kind that is fully present throughout the body. All of your cells have the same information. And this is precisely what Aristotle's soul was. It was something that contained instructions for a body, and it was fully present at each point in the body. And information, it's very difficult to explain how, if you begin the universe with physical entities that are initially present in the Planck time after the Big Bang, then it's hard to explain how something immaterial could come into existence by simply rearranging, aggregating physical entities. And so the problem of information and it's how it came to be is a great difficulty, which the theist says in the beginning was the logos and doesn't have a problem with information. But if you say in the beginning were the particles, you're going to have a tough time explaining that. Now, letter B, theism and naturalism regarding morality and intrinsic value. There are objective moral obligations. This is self-evident. Torturing little babies for the fun of it is wrong. Wisdom and kindness are virtues. Being an arrogant, bigoted, racist slob is a vice. If people say, well, I don't agree, they don't need an argument, they need a therapist. These kinds of things are just self-evident. Somebody says they don't believe in objective moral values, you find out what they care about, treat it as though it's relative and trivial and see what happens. I met a guy who cared about the environment but didn't believe in God. And I told him that I was in the habit of pouring acid in a local lake with a bunch of friends to see how many fish we'd kill, and we took bets on how many would die. And the guy got really angry. Well, it turned out he thought that what we were doing was, guess what? Wrong. So that I said, well, you're not a relativist, sir. You're only a relativist when it comes to sex and other things that are convenient to your lifestyle, but you all of a sudden become an absolutist when it comes to things that matter. The problem is not whether or not there are objective moral duties. The question is, how could there be such a thing? And science can only tell us what is the case. It cannot tell us what ought to be the case. Moral duties impose on us, they legislate obligations and responsibilities. Now, the only thing that has the power to legislate would be a free personal agent that can legislate, drive traffic laws or whatever it might be. And so the best explanation of the fact that there are objective moral duties and legislations would be that there is a moral legislator or lawgiver, and one is simpler than multiplying entities beyond what is needed. Free will and moral responsibility. If you had an electrode in your head that a scientist snuck into your room and implanted an electrode in your brain, and he could punch that electrode with a computer across the street and cause your body to do anything he wanted it to. He saw you walking down the sidewalk, a gentleman is coming toward you and he wants to punch the gentleman in the face. So when you get right up to him, he hits his computer, it causes the chip in your brain to vibrate. That deterministically causes a desire to punch the guy in the face, and your body satisfies that desire. Now, the truth is that you are not the responsible agent. It is the scientist who hit the gentleman through you. You are a passive instrument. You are not in control of your own actions, and thus you're not free. If naturalism is true, there is no what we call robust free will, the power to choose or refrain from choosing without anything determining what I do. The reason is because you are a physical object, or you are a conscious physical object where your consciousness is epiphenomenal. It is determined by the underlying physical structure of your brain at any given moment. It follows that your body movements are governed by the laws of chemistry and physics. And whether they're deterministic or there's indeterminism, it doesn't matter. In neither case can you be a responsible agent. The only way there could be responsibility is if you were not physical, you have a soul or an I or a self, and that will raise difficulties for the naturalists as to where such a thing could come from. The objectivity of intrinsic value. As I said, science can tell us what is the case, but it cannot tell us what ought to be the case. Now, there are three areas of human life where we have intrinsic value properties that are instantiated. One is in the life of morality. And there are certain things that have the property of intrinsic goodness or worth. A little baby has the property of intrinsic goodness. An act of kindness is constituted by the property of being good. It is something we ought to do. It is intrinsically valuable. So we have normativity in ethics because there are intrinsic normative properties of goodness and rightness that living things and acts have. In rationality, there are certain states of the mind that are inherently normatively rational. That is to say, they're states that we ought to be in. If P then Q and P, and my mind is in the state, therefore Q, that is an inherently rational state. I ought to be in the state, therefore Q. I shouldn't be in the state, therefore not Q. Again, in an inductive argument, a set of reasons should lead me to be in the state that so-and-so is the most reasonable, correct view of the matter. Sometimes we can't tell, but a lot of times we can. So there are rational oughts. There are rational obligations. To violate a rational ought is not to be immoral, it's to be irrational. And finally, there are aesthetic properties. Some things are inherently beautiful, other things aren't. Now, if the naturalist is right, then there are no normative properties. There are just descriptive properties that happen to be. But so not only does normativity and ethics go by the board, but there is no longer any such thing as normative rationality or aesthetics. So what naturalism does is it destroys reason itself. And this is one of the ways it does so. There are many, but the way I'm mentioning is that by not allowing there to be normativity, there can be no normative rational principles or normative mental states that are intrinsically reasonable to be in. Now, the reality of high intrinsic equal human value, everybody wants to believe in equal human rights, but as Peter Singer at Princeton said, the only way to justify that is if there's such a thing as the image of God. And he was an atheist. And so the reason that's true is if we're going to have a basis for believing in equal human rights, human beings have to have something in common that's equal, and whatever that is, it's got to be precious and have gravitas. It's got to be weighty. So there are smart, dumb, good-looking, ugly, socially useful, socially useless human beings. We don't really have anything that has gravitas in common, says Singer, unless it would be something like the image of God, an inherent preciousness or dignity, which is going to make any naturalist, says Singer, queasy and a bit uncomfortable. Well, I agree. And so there is a basis for the Christian theists to believe in equal human rights, but I don't see how an unbeliever can justify that commitment. Now, letter C is the origin of consciousness. Very quickly, you can't get mind from matter. If you start with brute matter as it is depicted in the hard sciences, and the history of the world is the rearrangement of that, you're not going to get consciousness popping into existence. Now, very quickly, I want to say a word about scientism, and then we'll have a time of Q&A. I want to raise three criticisms to scientism. The first is that strong scientism is self-refuting. Remember, strong scientism is the view that the only propositions that can be true or rationally warranted are those that are testable by the hard sciences. And that should be obvious. That statement itself is not a statement of the hard sciences. It is a philosophical statement about the hard sciences. In fact, it's actually a statement in the area called epistemology. Therefore, like the saying, there are no sentences longer than 3 words, or there are no truths, which both refute themselves because they falsify their own criteria of acceptability. So the statement of strong scientism does not live up to its own standards of acceptability, and consequently, it is self-refuting. Now, this objection doesn't work for weak scientism, but it does work for strong scientism. The second objection involves the assumptions of science, and it works against both versions of scientism. Science makes a whole host of assumptions. Now, every single one of these assumptions, every one of them, is being called into question and been subject to critique in the academy over the last 50 years or so. The task of stating what those assumptions are and defending them from critique is a task of philosophy, not science. Science cannot state, much less defend its own assumptions. And some of those assumptions are the propositions of logic and mathematics, which are a priori fields. They're not a posteriori fields. Logic and mathematics are things we know prior to sense experience without needing sense experience to justify a law of logic. A law of logic isn't like all ravens are black. It's not an empirical generalization. It's a necessary truth. Furthermore, the laws of mathematics, the very existence and nature of truth, the very existence and nature of knowledge, the fact that our faculties of perception and thinking allow us to gain knowledge of the world's deep structure. The deep structure of the world is the structure that lies beyond and underneath what we can sense with our five senses. And we have discovered that our minds are able to lay hold of that deep structure, that deep structure is subject to the principle of simplicity, and mathematics can be used to describe the world's deep structure. I'm talking about the unobservable laws of physics and chemistry, for example. This is absolutely shocking, because if evolution were the only way that we got our faculties may be apt for sense impressions, but it wouldn't have any reason to be apt for things that go beyond them, because we don't need that to survive. Now, these assumptions have been challenged. The correspondence theory of truth is widely rejected. If science is going to be taken in a realist way, that is, its theories give us approximately true descriptions of the world, then these assumptions that underlie science must be stated and justified, but philosophy does that, science cannot. If science cannot justify its own assumptions, then we have to take its success in anti-realist terms, meaning that we would allow that science yields useful predictions and useful fictions, but it is not giving us a true picture of the world. Finally, we know, the final critique of scientism is there are many things that we know with greater certainty outside of science than the things that we know inside science. For example, the laws of logic and mathematics are far more epistemically secure than is the laws of gravity or the nature of the electron. It's not inconceivable that 50 years from now, we will not believe our current view of the electron is true. So our current understanding of the electron, though reasonable, might be tentative. It's hard to believe that a law of logic like modus ponens, or the moral principle torturing babies for the fun of it, will, in 50 years, we will have new evidence that shows that we were wrong about those laws altogether. I can see that people might no longer believe them, but there would not be evidence that those principles are not true. Therefore, there are things we know with greater certainty outside of science than we do things in science, and scientism is defeated. So in sum then, it is important to know naturalism, and I want to encourage you to do some reading on it. And again, I'm not trying to sell a book. I don't think I'd make much off of it anyway. But Scientism and Secularism is a very good readable treatment of these things, and it would be a good thing for you to learn more about the nature of naturalism.